Welcome, everyone. You are listening to the Theology Mill from Wipf and Stock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle, and I work here at Wipf and Stock, and I'm also the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with some of the leading authors in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, come stop by our website at wipfandstock.com. That's W-I-P-F and stock, S-T-O-C-K.com. So in this interview for our Barth Booth, I had the chance to talk with Dr. Slade, the Associate Rector of Trinity Church in Princeton and the Canon Theologian of the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey. Here we talk about a host of topics related to Karl Barth, including the ecclesial setting of Barth's theology, the conclusiveness of God's action in Jesus Christ, Barth's reception among North American Anglicans, Barth's theology of time, as well as some of the promising prospects for Barth's studies today. In the episode description, you'll find a link for our Barth Booth, where you can browse a large selection we've put together of our books by and about Karl Barth, which also includes a 50% discount on all the books featured in the booth, and that discount runs through April 14th, 2023. Dr. Slade's book, The Fullness of Time, is also included in that booth, and so it's offered at a 50% off discount as well. So without further ado, friends, let's head over to the interview. Okay, well, I am here with Dr. Is it Kara or Kara?
Kara
Slade, okay, who is the associate, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, by the way, the Associate Rector at Trinity Church in Princeton, as well as the Canon Theologian of the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey, and who also holds a Duke PhD in theology. Now, you also have a PhD in like mechanical engineering, don't you?
I do, it's true. So you can see the sort of the record of my bad life decisions, but that's right. Yeah. So.
Nice. Okay, and we are sharing a drink again, just as with Kait Dugan from the Pacific Coast to the East Coast. And I've got a couple of drinks actually here. I'm being kind of a glutton this morning. I was at the bottom of my coffee cup, so I was like, I need to bring another drink with me to get me through. So I have some black coffee from this grocery store called New Seasons over here in Portland, and then I have a Health Aid kombucha. I've never tried this one before. Wow. It has blood orange, carrot, and ginger. All of that sounds great except for the carrot, so we'll see how it turns out. I'm not quite sure about that, but what are you sipping on?
Yeah, I've just got my I've got my Coke here. So just kind of a traditionalist.
Nice. Yeah, there's like nothing better, honestly, in my opinion, than a lunch with like a Coke in a glass bottle with like the Mexican cane sugar.
Oh, absolutely.
You just can't beat that.
Absolutely.
Okay, well let's talk about Barth. I'm curious what sort of impresses you the most about him as a theologian to kick things off.
Yeah, this is really a simple answer, I think, to this question and it's not about kind of intellectual impressiveness as much as it is about the way that he relentlessly points to Jesus in a way that draws other people to Jesus as well. I remember when I was picking my dissertation topic with Willie Jennings at Duke, he said, write on what excites you the most about being Christian. And that, for me, Barth was that person who makes me the most excited about being a Christian and who, through a kind of radical reorienting of our thought towards the person and work of Jesus.
Could you tell me a little bit more about what it is that sort of you enjoy? Like you said that, in writing that you were trying to figure out, what most excites you about being a Christian. So could you tell me a little bit more about what it is about Barth that sort of gets you pumped up?
Well, I think that it's there's something about it that and I gotta be honest, brings me to praise of God. Thinking about the absoluteness of God's action towards us and for us in Jesus, and the way that Bart won't let us mess around with other stuff. Right? He won't let us get bogged down in things that we shouldn't get bogged down in. Intellectually, theologically, ecclesially. And say, no, turn your eyes towards Jesus, turn your eyes towards Jesus, and then everything else becomes clear in the light of the cross. And I think the way that he's very clear about the intersection between theology and the proclamation of the church, right? Theology is a church activity. And as I'm sitting here talking to you right now, I'm looking out my window at the tower of Trinity Church, and where I work, and I'm very fortunate to be able to work as really as a parish priest and as a theologian for the church, working in the church, and that's where Barth is coming from also. It's not an intellectual exercise that's somehow divorced from preaching actual sermons to actual people, pastoring actual people who sit in pews.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the his pastoral heart really comes through, and also I feel like it shows in how much of a cult following he has among pastors. I feel like that's pretty unique because I'm coming from a Catholic setting, and even among priests, but especially among lay people, there's not really besides sort of catechism theology or papal encyclicals, there's not necessarily a lot of knowledge of the big heavy hitters of the 20th century, von Balthasar de Lubach or whatever. But one thing I know about a lot of Protestant pastors is that they know their Barth very, very well. So I think that that's kind of special and unique, and I wish that we could sort of cultivate that on the Catholic side as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you had to kind of sit back though and poke some holes in Barth's system, what would you say are some of the biggest weaknesses?
Well, I think the weakness, maybe a weakness, is also a strength insofar as the way that doctrines interweave with each other, right? I mean, to some extent, the doctrine of reconciliation pops up in every volume, right? The doctrine of creation pops up in every, it's not like you have one thing in one place and here is everything that you need to know about, topic X. It's much more intricately woven than that. So, and that's something that can engender, I think, bad readings of Barth if someone looks in one place and it's like, yes, this is all of what Barth had to say, and so thus this is Barth's position on pick your topic. I mean, a really notorious example of this is the way that he talks about human finitude in the sections in 3:2 on the limits of our time as a gift, and people will kind of turn that into yes, Karl Barth didn't believe in any kind of eternal life that isn't the life we're living right now, right? And I think that's just not borne out by, the entirety of, you just have to look at everything that he has to say, and of course his sermons also point you in a very different direction. But I think people sometimes can tend to Barth proof text, right? And that's not helpful because it's not the way that he writes.
Yeah, I think that's something that came through in talking with Kait Dugan too, is that there's sort of this never-ending poetic unfolding about his theology that you really couldn't just turn to one volume or one section of a volume and say, this is Barth's doctrine of reconciliation or whatever, which that kind of makes him daunting in a way though, because he wrote just so much. But
Yeah,
which kind of go ahead.
It rewards patience, right? He rewards patience, and I think I can say, now I've read the vast majority of the dogmatics, right? And but it's taken me a while to get to that point. Certainly there are senior scholars who have a vastly deeper command of it than I do. But still it's something that's hard to kind of, if you're trying to dip your toe in, it can be a little bit hard to know where to start. Certainly with church dogmatics, if people say, "Oh, what should I read of the church dogmatics?" I'm like, "Oh, wait,
yeah,
maybe start in another place," right?
Yeah. Okay, so with that in the foreground, sort of the vastness of his project, if you had to, and this is a very difficult question, I know, but if you had to kind of sum up as briefly as you could his theological project, how would you do so?
Yeah, I would say something like, in loving freedom, God has acted conclusively in Jesus Christ to defeat sin and death. And in doing so, also shows us what it means to be truly human. Something like that. I'll probably change my mind about that in about 8 hours, and I'll be like, "No, you got to add this." But of course, interestingly, so I've been putting together my sermon for Sunday, and John 3:16 is part of the lectionary text, right, in the gospel. And I am talking a little bit about, that it might be an apocryphal story, but it might also be true that this is something that that Barth said in 1962, either at the University of Chicago or one other place, that someone asked, can you sum up your intellectual project? And he said, supposedly, Jesus loves me, this I know. The Bible tells me so.
Yeah.
Right? Which is actually a much thicker statement than you might first admit, because it tells us, what is the heart of the gospel, and how do I know that it's, how do I know this, right?
Yeah.
How do I think about Revelation? And I'm trying really hard not to turn my sermon into a sermon on the doctrine of Revelation. Like, nobody wants to hear that. So, but we'll see. But I think,
go ahead.
I think some of the key elements are, God acts in loving freedom. God acts towards humanity, in Jesus Christ, in a conclusive and all-encompassing way, and in God's act that then shows us things about creation and creaturely life as well, right? One of my favorite things about Barth is when he, he'll say, we don't want to develop a kind of separate doctrine of sin, to which Jesus is then a kind of answer to an algebra problem. I'm going to look at Jesus and define sin as the things that are not contrary to that, right? I mean, it's a radically different approach, but I think there's such beauty in it, right? To say, we have to look at that saving act first as the thing that explains everything else.
Yeah, I had also heard that story about his response to the question about, what's sort of the core of his theology. I chuckled out loud. It's hilarious. But I think it was maybe in Hauerwas's Gifford lectures on Barth and others. I think it might have been there. I'm not totally sure. But he, wherever it was, it's sort of talking about how like at the heart of Barth's project is sort of this really simple message, actually, but that the voluminousness of his work is because it sort of has to be perpetually restated. Like you have to sort of like sing, like just sing new refrains, to the same chorus over and over, which I thought was a really interesting and helpful, and also kind of reminds me of like von Balthasar a bit, who similarly wrote just a stupid amount of theology, but
and it was also really kind of challenging to get a grip on, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I read the stuff I had to read of von Balthasar, and trying to read a little bit of it and understand what he's about, you are left with a kind of less than complete understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think thankfully they both have like shorter volumes as well that are helpful for sort of getting into the fray, but at the same time they're Balthasar's trilogy and Barth's dogmatics are sort of where the meat is, so you sort of have to get, at least in my opinion, like you sort of have to get into those at some point. But
absolutely.
What would you say at kind of the popular level is the biggest misconception that people have about Barth and his theology?
Oh, gosh. And it's good that you've also, I love that you've just talked to Kait about this, about Barth as well. I think that there's a misconception that Barth is kind of a bro theology, right? Or it's a kind of a, goes with a kind of an aggressive, macho intellectual posture, or a kind of argumentativeness, and it's just not true. And I think that if you look at the folks who are doing wonderful work with Barth these days, it's definitely not a monolithic group of straight white men.
Yes, for sure.
There are a lot of people from a lot of different standpoints and backgrounds who are finding in Barth fruitful conversation partners for their own projects, and so I think that that's a big misconception. And then also I think it's a misconception that, and again, sitting in the chair that I'm sitting in right now geographically, that somehow if you're a Barth person, you have to fight with other Barth people. And Kait, again, the Center for Barth Studies has done a wonderful job in really fostering a sense of community among Barth folks. There's a PhD student conference that they put together. Really one of the most formative experiences of my life. You have 12 PhD students who come together to read through a volume of the Dogmatics and do little papers on everybody is assigned a part, and then you write on it. And that kind of intense community building, I think, has gone a long way as well to show a different way forward. So, I think if folks are hesitant to wade into those waters because they think it's a particular kind of a scene, it's not that kind of a scene anymore.
Yeah, no, that was definitely the impression I got, and from it, everything I've heard from others, it definitely seems like people are really big fans of what Kait is doing with the Barth Center, and kind of bringing in a wide cast of voices, and non-white voices, but not just in America, but even on kind of a global scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I think is great. Okay, so for those who are new, we've talked about this a bit already, but for those who are new, where should they start with Barth? Are there specific volumes by him himself that people should start with, and are there sort of intros or other secondary sources that would be sort of good entry points for folks?
Yeah, two things that I really recommend. First, that Barth text that I would recommend people start with is Dogmatics and Outline, right? It's short. It's just a little commentary on the Apostles' Creed. And you start to get a sense of what Barth is doing intellectually. But it's something that you could, I'm actually reading through it for Lent, right? So it's something that you can read, as a Lenten discipline, or, I wouldn't, I don't know if there's anyone who would want to do it as a beach read, but it's a manageable, right? It's a manageable little book. You're not committing to 500 pages. The other thing that I recommend is a little book called The Great Passion by Eberhard Busch, which is a secondary text, an introduction to Barth's theology that also weaves in some biographical information, because you really can't separate who Barth was, in the context that he was in, certainly, right? In the in the church struggle of the German church, in the unfolding events of World War II, and then afterwards, right? The kind of the new, the Cold War, Barth's theology doesn't sort of fall out of the sky as a kind of abstract entity. It comes out of that. And so I think it's important to see, how, Barth as a scholar, as a pastor, how that sort of generates how he does his work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love what you said about the Dogmatics and Outline not being a beach read. I think I saw a funny tweet a while back about this guy saying he just couldn't bring himself to pull out his book on Nietzsche that he had in his backpack while he was sitting in his child's doctor's office, which I thought was just hilarious. But even in something that's not so intense, I've experienced this on planes, when you pull out a big thick theology book, you just sort of wonder what the people next to you are thinking about.
That's why you got to get a Kindle, and just then it's nobody's business. Then it's nobody's business what you're reading. I did read Ben Meyer's Apostles' Creed commentary at the beach once. I was with Sonia Waters, a pastoral theology professor at PTS, and we were at the beach, and then she was reading On Beauty and Being Just, by Lane's Scary, and so we were kind of a bunch of weirdos at the Jersey Shore.
That's awesome. Okay, as far as the church dogmatics, this is probably also a really hard question, but what would you say is your personal favorite volume out of all of them, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the one that everybody says, but for one, okay? For one, because the way that Barth walks us through the saving work of Christ, the journey of the Son of God into the far country, the judge judged in our place, the verdict of the Father, the kind of the heart of the Paschal mystery. That's something I read every year during Holy Week. The journey of the Son into the far country in 4:1. But it's just such a beautiful meditation on the passion and the resurrection, and then the way that he takes the way that he defines sin around cross and resurrection, right? Especially his section on defining sin in terms of pride in 4:1 is kind of the big the big kind of reference, as he's talking about sin as one of the roots of all other sin, the act of putting ourselves in God's place, right? And I find that really powerful as well, as I was saying earlier, because this is where he starts setting out and says, I'm not going to do a kind of a natural law thing. I'm not going to do something where we say, yes, well, we can all agree on what sin is, right? it comes from this other, some other place. But he will say, no, let's start with Jesus and then work out our doctrine of sin from there. So that the person and work of Christ is primary, and isn't a kind of, again, and isn't an answer to an algebra problem, isn't like a solve for X. And I found that really, I find that really helpful as well. And I find it a really helpful way to talk to people in churches about sin. Especially people who maybe are coming from church backgrounds where they've been kind of bludgeoned with the kind of very, very long thou shalt not list, when some of the thou shalt nots are actually just kind of cultural, right? Or have to do a lot more with gender roles or this, that, and the other than with what is of God and what is not of God. And so it can be a way to really reorient that conversation around sin, so that you don't jettison the concept of sin, right? Because it is important, but it's important to do that in a way that doesn't become just kind of a violence on people. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I think Kait also, I know we keep mentioning her, I think she also said, I don't remember if she said 4:1 or just 4 in its entirety was her favorite, but she also said, kind of like you, she said it was almost something of a cliche at Princeton for people to choose 4 as their favorite, but nonetheless, that's what she chose. So there must be some truth to the cliche, I guess.
I mean, I also love 3:2. I mean, the doctrine of creation is wonderful, but if I had to pick one, my desert island volume would be 4:1.
Okay. So one question I have is, as an Anglican priest yourself, how would you say that Barth has been received among Anglican scholars, especially in America, or we could broaden it to North America, and how might his theology sort of benefit those Anglicans in America?
Yeah, I mean, Anglicans influenced by Barth are it's kind of everywhere, right? I mean, I don't think there are more Anglicans doing it than Presbyterians, but it's getting close, right? Kait Sonderegger is obviously a stellar example of someone who's been shaped by Barth. On the more kind of preaching end of things, Fleming Rutledge, and Catherine Tanner in her own way. So I think there's a lot, and of course certainly interacting with Barth, Oliver O'Donovan. So it's kind of a lot of it, right? And I think that that's a great joy. It's a great joy to find other people within my own tradition who find Barth helpful. And as we all kind of, I mean, there are things, and you can appreciate this yourself. There are things that we have to kind of pay less attention to in Barth, right? I'm not going to get my sacramental theology from him,
right?
But there's a critical mass of folks who find him helpful within our own tradition, and I think that's a real joy. I think that by the same token, the kind of the theological community within Anglicanism is one thing, and again, what happens in churches is maybe something else again. There are some, certainly some parish clergy who are very influenced by Barth. I think also of the kind of Mockingbird folks who find Barth a helpful conversation partner, Mockingbird Ministries. But I think that by and large, many more Episcopal clergy are shaped by more of a kind of liberal Protestant, something between liberal Protestant and liberal Catholic ways of thinking theologically, and I think that one of the helpful things that people who love Barth and find Barth helpful a role that we can play within, certainly within North American Anglicanism, is to maybe kind of be a little bit of a burr under the saddle of some of the tendencies towards a natural theology, right? Or a kind of a pneumatological focus that maybe becomes fuzzy, right? Talking about the Spirit in vague terms without reference to Christ, which is a common tendency, I think, in Protestant liberalism today.
Yeah.
And so I think that Barth can act as a little bit of a nudge or a corrective. I think that's a big part of what I see my own vocation or my charism as within my church is to be a very good-natured irritant. As Barth himself talks about the Eisenheim altarpiece, and how it represents the theological task, and to be that John the Baptist pointing the finger at Jesus and say, he must increase and I must decrease, and that's I think where I find myself within my own tradition.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's really helpful for situating things. Do you think that Anglicans sort of have to have a more reformed bent to appreciate Barth, or do you think that, you've kind of alluded to this a bit in terms of liberal Protestants and sort of some of the hurdles they have to overcome to appreciate Barth or to be challenged by Barth, but I'm interested too in as far as maybe the Anglo-Catholic scene, do you find that you mentioned a bit about sacramental theology, but do you find that they have hurdles to overcome in reading Barth?
Less than you would think.
Okay.
Right? Less than you would think. I know a number of Anglo-Catholic folks who find Barth really, really helpful. And I think that one thing these days within Anglicanism, I think that Reformed Anglicans and Anglo-Catholic, certainly within the Episcopal Church, Reformed Episcopalians and Anglo-Catholic Episcopalians share a lot more, perhaps, in terms of convictions than we once did, just because I think that kind of what we used to call party spirit, right, of low church versus high church really isn't the defining.
Yeah.
It's not a kind of a defining thing as much as it used to be. And so I know plenty of folks who who love fiddleback chasubles and incense and are avid readers of Barth because they really, really love Jesus.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And love to read someone who keeps a focus on Jesus. Certainly, there can be some things in terms of for Anglo-Catholics, like the way Barth's anthropology works, nature and grace, that kind of thing, they might, have some differences there. But I think that they still can find him helpful and interesting.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So you and others have kind of spoken about Barth's volumes on the doctrine of reconciliation. So if I'm getting this right, that'd be 4.1 through 4.3 as kind of the interpretive heart of his church dogmatics. So what, I know you've talked a bit about this already, but what would you say he's kind of up to in those volumes? And then how do they figure in sort of his broader project in the church dogmatics?
Well, so first of all, it puts cross and resurrection at the center, which is where it has to be for him. Everything flows out from from the cross and resurrection. And that, that wondrous act of God, that once and for all act of God, is at the core of everything. And yet it's also, between 4:1 and 4:2, you see the kind of the pivot towards, okay, this is what God has done. What does that mean for the witness of the church, right? And it, it can be interesting to see. I read 4:1 there was a gap of time between when I read 4:1 and when I read 4:2. And I read 4:2 with Doug Campbell as an independent study in my PhD program. But the wonderful thing about 4:2 for me is how it really, it puts the lie to the idea that Barth can turn you into some kind of a quietist, right? That say, the work of Jesus is accomplished, and so, let's go fishing, right?
Yeah.
The definitiveness of the work of the cross is so, it's crashing. It's, it's absolute. And yet then Barth comes along in 4:2 and says, well, I've already talked to you about pride being a bad thing. Now I'm going to talk to you about sloth being a bad thing. Right. And so that's, that once and for allness of the cross then frees us as witnesses, right? It sends us out as witnesses. And I think that it's just such a wonderful pivot into kind of the life of the church and what Christians are called to do in loving God and loving their neighbors. And I would encourage people to read both, right? So that you see how it builds up the life of the church, the life of the Christian, and the call of the Christian. So,
yeah, it seems similar to sort of the charge that Stanley Hauerwas gets a lot of, like, sort of people saying that he's Phidias. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right, but that, like, sort of his message is, right, the church's job is to be the church, and
right.
her job is to proclaim the gospel, and so I think the charge is basically that, well, that's just that, and then you don't have to. The church doesn't actually have to. It can just focus on sort of being itself rather than like going out and doing, which I don't think is really fair. Which I don't really think is fair to.
No, it's not fair. I mean, it's also silly. It's a silly kind of an accusation. And I think that Professor Hauerwas would be the first to say that that's not what I mean, but sometimes people will draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think like many have also framed Barth's corpus as sort of necessarily grounded in ethics, which you might not get on sort of first learning about Barth at just sort of a surface level. So could you say a little bit about how kind of his I want to say systematics, even though I know he rejects that term, but I guess his dogmatics, but I mean more than just his church dogmatics, but his whole project. Could you say how this speaks to ethical concerns and why such a grounding in ethics is actually important to him?
Yeah, I mean, I think he says pretty explicitly that the idea that there's a thing called ethics that's somehow separate from dogmatics is crazy, right? I mean, this should not be a comprehensible Christian position, right? That ethics and dogmatics is ethics, right? It's not that you get your system right and then ethics is kind of over here. You can't see my hand. I'm saying over here in some other realm. Okay. And that's just not the way that it works. We act in the world based on our convictions about who Jesus is and what God has done, right? In acting. Amy Laura Hall taught me that the two most fundamental questions in Christian ethics, in scare quotes, are the lawyer's question to Jesus, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus's question to Peter, but who do you say that I am? Right? And those two questions go together, right? Because if Jesus says love your neighbor and Jesus is not the Son of God, then who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Right? If he's just some guy, then what force do his commandments have?
Mm-hmm.
They're just kind of good ideas, I guess. But those things do go together. And also, if you look, it takes more than a surface read. In the Dogmatics, you see that the ethical content within it, and you can see especially how he is, aiming at, in the earlier volumes of the Dogmatics, especially, Nazi totalitarianism, and everything that represents, and this kind of, idea that an idolatrous state could claim to be the master of destiny or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the later volumes, you also see him take aim pretty uncomfortably at post-war United States, and what that came to represent in the world, and the kind of capitalistic confidence, worship of the market, even. So you see woven in his ethical material, also in the doctrine of creation. You see a lot of this. So, it's there, but then again, it's not so easy as to turn to a section that says, here is the ethics. Here is all the ethics. I mean, the ethics is all through it. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, for sure. No, yeah, I think that's super helpful way to think about it. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about sort of the contemporary landscape of Barth studies. And I know in our shared Google Doc, you said you don't want to talk about different camps, and that's totally fair. So maybe we could speak instead sort of more generally about just sort of the landscape of Barth studies today. So Paul Nimmo kind of describes the landscape as kind of having two main camps, and then in his language, these two camps are, on the one hand, kind of an ecumenical evangelical Catholicism, and then on the other hand, a liberative reading that prioritizes themes of freedom and justice, and also recommends resistance against the powers that oppress. So do you think that this kind of rendering is helpful? Do you think it's helpful or harmful to think about Barth scholarship in terms of camps? Or maybe just, if you'd prefer to talk about it in terms of kind of how the landscape of kind of how he's been received, especially in North America, that'd be great.
I think that I would say that the evangelical Catholic reading is also deeply intermeshed with theologies of resistance against oppressive powers. So I think that it's not so much of a the division. I think that's a division that is a lot muddier than that kind of statement would make it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, and I don't know, man. I just don't find that. I just find that whole conversation just unhelpful, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I think that it, so much kind of energy orbited around it, and I think that this is one of the ways that I'm very aware of having been trained as a Duke Barthian and not a PTS Barthian. I feel like a little bit of an interloper still around here. Just because that wasn't really topic of conversation, right? At Duke, I think there were different questions that folks were interested in, more in terms of bringing Barth into conversation with I think with problems in the world is maybe a bad way to put it, but of using Barth as a conversation partner more broadly, okay, as opposed to trying to find the one true interpretation, or thinking that that's a possible thing, right? I mean, I have in my mind interpretations that I think are probably closer to the way I read it and further away from the way I read it. But I think that the last thing that Barth would have wanted to happen is to generate Barth scholasticism. Yeah. And so I think that he would have been appalled at the idea of the existence of Barthians, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that he, he would want to, to guide people to become better witnesses, better pastors, deeper theological thinkers, but not maybe, trying to figure out who's the correct interpreter of him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there seems to be like kind of almost an obsessive quality about all these attempts to try to sort of discern what's, like you said, what's the one true kind of Barthianism. Mm-hmm. I know I'm bringing up Hauerwas a lot too, but I see that a lot in like this sort of lively, very heated debate about whether or not he's like a true Barthian. Which is kind of funny. Because like you said, like Barth was not really interested. Like even said, like I don't want to produce Barthians. Like I want my students to go beyond me. And then Hauerwas too doesn't really seem to have his strong investment in being like a Barthian of a strict observance. To a certain extent, right? So it's sort of ironic that people are just sort of like really, just like really getting into hairline fracture after hairline fracture about whether or not he's a Barthian of a strict observance.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, the Duke of, when I was at Duke was certainly, a wonderfully eclectic place, right? You could be in conversation with Aquinas, you can be in conversation with Augustine, with Barth, with James Cone, right? And it was, the fruitfulness of those interactive conversations, where I think is a lot more than trying to just interpreting Barth over and against himself. So that's my thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to move to talking about your recent book, The Fullness of Time, which you published with us at Cascade. So in there, you're exploring Barth's theology of time, sort of in relationship to the violence of sort of the time of like scientific modernity. Mm-hmm, so what would you say are the biggest problems with the scientific time within scientific modernity, and then what does Barth's theology of time sort of have to say in response?
One of the deepest assumptions that I think people operate with and don't even realize that they're operating with it is the idea that time is a kind of a linear trajectory of progress. Every day in every way, we're getting better and better. As humans, we're working our way up to the kingdom of God. And that shows up in different ways. It shows up in ways that people will just kind of tell the stories of human origins in ways that make current current situations seem like the inevitable outworking of progress when they're actually deeply politically contingent, right? Like, you know, industrialization is not an inevitable, natural outflowering of history, you know, or colonialism or something like this. It's just not. And by the same token, you know, the idea that progress, human progress, then can sort of bring in the, you know, brings in the kingdom. That a human project can usher in the kingdom of God. And you know, and this sort of brought me into conversation with the social gospel movement, and you know, God bless them. They were very optimistic about what people could do, and they were also really terrified by kind of the specter of urban chaos or anarchists. And again, there was a very particular politics embedded in that. Along with ideas of progress also are the ideas of that some people are at different places along that trajectory of progress than others, right? So I, as a white Western scientifically literate person, you know, I am in the present, you know, time is with me. But maybe, you know, there might be other people who are somehow backwards or primitive, in big scare quotes, or marked somehow as retrograde, you know, who then are, you know, then that's the way that we mark an inferiority. It's also a way that we kind of foreclose the possibility of a real politics, right? If you don't occupy the same time as me, then I don't have to deal with you like as a neighbor. You know, you're not, you're less than me in a deep way. So Barth, in bringing all of time under the lordship of Jesus, he really kind of radically brings us back to where we are. You know, says, no, don't be trying to flee back into the past to try to make sense of things. Don't flee into the future and the kind of utopianism. So, you know, Jesus Christ is the Lord of time, and Jesus, we've been given, and this is a Hauerwas quote, all the time in the world, right? And we can receive that, you know, the time of Jesus Christ is given back to us as a gift. That's the time of the resurrection, Barth says. And so putting all of our time being sort of embraced and taken up in Christ should free us from those anxieties, right? Should free us from the prison of having to make our time significant somehow, or to, you know, that of thinking that we have to, you know, save the world with our own efforts, because, you know, the world has been saved. That doesn't absolve us from doing things, as I said earlier, but it does mean that we are not Jesus. And that witness looks something different than having to save the world.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. One question I have is in sort of working that out at a concrete level, like how would this is maybe a really hard question, but how would the sort of time of resurrection that Barth talks about, like how would that actually look for us today in sort of our very frenzied, rushed lives, where we're constantly entertained and constantly sort of making the most and sort of trying to I don't know, just I guess just make the most of our time constantly.
Well, I think that you know, it points to how time is not a thing for us to grasp or control, right? It isn't our possession.
Right.
But then also, you know, the most beautiful thing about Barth's treatment of time for me is honestly some of the pastoral implications, and so many people, more people than not, most people, live with things that there can be really kind of trapped in regret or trapped in events of their past that they cannot, that are over determining their lives now, right? So have a hold on them that they can't, that seems unshakable.
Yeah.
And Barth has a beautiful passage where he says, we can't burn our diaries, right? And think that that's going to make it go away. We can't pretend that things never happened, but also, in the time of Jesus Christ, they should have, it points us towards those things not having control over us.
Yeah.
We don't have to forget them, but we don't have to be bound by them either. And the same thing with, with the future, when folks are always, and I can be as guilty of this as anyone, always looking to the next thing.
Yeah.
Always looking to, okay, what's next? What's, I always tell myself, it's charming. I'm 51 years old. You would think I'd figure this out by now. I look at my calendar, I say, oh, this week is terrible. Next week looks a lot clearer, though. If you get through this week, then next week will be great.
Yeah.
It's always a kind of utopianism of the calendar 2 weeks from now.
Yeah.
And it never works out that way. But, we always want to construct utopias, or we always want to expect, in the future, next year things will be better, or this way, somehow the future is going to solve the condition of humans in the present.
Yeah.
That doesn't work either. Right? And so, how can we be in the moment that we're in? I think is one thing that he gives us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very helpful. Okay, so in your book, you also spend a lot of time looking at Kierkegaard and then Kierkegaard's influence on Barth. So could you say a little bit about what exactly this influence was that he had on Barth?
Yeah, the most explicit places where you see Kierkegaard's influence are in his early work, especially in the Romans commentary. You'll see the way that Barth really tries to knock the thinking religious subject, knock the feet out from under the thinking religious subject.
Yeah.
Right. By this kind of upending act of God. That's a very Kierkegaardian notion, right? It's the difference between, Kierkegaard will say, we encounter God not by means of an ascent, right? An ASCENT, right? Not by means of a ladder up, but by God's action towards us, right? Of the Lord becoming the servant. And that's very much the, you see that kind of logic in the Romans commentary of saying, no, you are not, you're not going to make a leap of faith up to God or anything. God is acting, and is going to knock you off your feet. And that's I think especially in the Romans commentary, and what he shares with Kierkegaard there is that sometimes you'll see theologians who think in twos and theologians who think in threes. Okay, so it can be a kind of an unresolved a twos, right? Would be an unresolved dialectic. It's this kind of paradoxical polarity. Okay. Or you can have a thinker of threes, which is maybe more of a synthesis, right? Or not this, but this. And both Kierkegaard and the Romer Brief, Barth are very much thinkers of twos.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, you have that kind of really kind of as well as seasickness inducing dialectical movement. I love it, but it is it's bracing. It's bracing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Do you think that Barth, like after his Epistle to the Romans, do you think that he sort of, I mean, obviously he never moves to sort of the threes group you're talking about, but do you think that, I guess my like very amateur beginning reading is that he sort of, his development sort of moves him, or just sort of like nuances his dialectics, so that it's not just so polarized. Do you see kind of a similar thing happening in his development, or how would you describe the way his
I think nuances is a good word. Nuances is a good word. I mean, so in 1963, he gives a lecture where he says, I never left Kierkegaard behind.
Yeah.
Never in all of his projects. I never really left Kierkegaard behind, but it certainly is a lot more subtle in the later Barth than in the earlier. I mean, certainly like the kind of the resolute focus on the atonement. That's it's a Kierkegaardian notion. But kind of methodologically, it does get nuanced later on, and I think I think that's one of the reasons that I really don't like Evangelical Theology. His book Evangelical Theology it's very late, right? And I'm like, oh, there's something about it that's less exciting, I think, because of the at that point the extent to which it's that kind of energy is smoothed out a little bit.
Yeah, so like it's become so nuanced that it's kind of missing the pop of some of his earlier work. Is that kind of what you're saying?
So.
Yeah. Okay, I want to leave you with one last question, and then I can let you go. Sort of as we look to the future of Barth scholarship, what do you see as some promising prospects beginning to unfold?
Well, I think we've already talked about a number of them. I think that certainly, again, I want to commend to everyone the work that Kait is doing at the Barth Center. She's really working really hard to open up opportunities to engage with Barth scholarship for underrepresented voices, for global voices, and I think that that's really, really important. I see really some wonderful work being done, especially in bringing Black theologies into conversation with Barth in fruitful ways. I mean, certainly I'm biased as Willie Jennings' student, but I think that his being in conversation with Barth and a kind of a Black liberation mold is incredibly fruitful. And I think that, in the climate in which we find ourselves in 21st century North America, that the conversations that bringing Barth into conversation with our current moment, remains really important. It remains crucial. And I look forward to that. I think that, I think there's energy to do different, to look at newer questions and not to rehearse the old questions.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah, for sure. No, yeah, I really appreciate Willie Jennings' stuff too. And I don't know, I'm not familiar enough with Barth's doctrine of creation.
Yes.
But I'm sort of assuming that Jennings is drawing from that a lot, because I know he did his PhD or his dissertation on, I can't remember if it was Barth's doctrine of creation or sort of creaturehood in Barth's
it's on Athanasius and Barth.
Okay.
But he's been very, very focused on the doctrine of creation, and there is so much there that is beautiful and worth lifting up. And I think that sometimes the previous conversations maybe have skipped a little bit from volume 2 to volume 4, right?
Yeah,
you have the kind of election conversation, and then volume 4, and certainly don't miss the goodness that's in the doctrine of creation. There's a lot.
I just found Jennings. I read his book, The Christian Imagination, I think is what it's called. His kind of big one. I just found that so illuminating, like that the issue of race, particularly in America, is so connected to sort of viewing people as sort of separate or detached from the land they call their own. I just found that's so helpful, and not a perspective I had heard in Theology as a Race before. So
it's good. It's good.
Really interesting stuff. Okay, well, thank you, Kara, so much for taking the time to chat today. It's been fun to talk with you about Barth, so thank you. Appreciate it a lot.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm really grateful to all of y'all for putting together this series and having some conversations about Barth, about topics that I think are really important. So thanks to all of you.